Assuming you've already sketched on another piece of paper and you're doing your final, sketch out your elements, staying away from the edges. We will get more into why we do that later. And draw very lightly. If you're using text, think about what kind of text you're going to use. Here I'm demonstrating block letters where I've lightly drawn the words ahead of time and then I'm doing a contour line or outline around them. Not really making noodle letters, but leaving enough space around each letter and going all the way around. This is how you would make a basic block letter. If you're using Sharpie, now would be the time to trace any details that you would be outlining in black. Doing so very carefully, but keeping in mind that if you've drawn your outlines light, you can erase them later. You can also use colored Sharpie or regular colored markers to do outlines as well. At this point, if you have outlined and you need to erase anything, this would be a good time to do that. Make sure you're using a good eraser and that you've tested on a separate piece of paper so it's not going to smear your work. And just make sure you get all of your erased lines done at this point. Okay friends, let's talk about color. Here I've already done some patterns in regular water-based markers and I'm coloring around each of the little designs with my crayon. If you're using a lighter crayon than marker, it might not matter so much if you don't go right in between the lines, but you're still going to want to try to not cover up the marker if it's possible, and color around any elements that you have drawn. Okay, let's talk about crayons. Let's not underestimate the power of the crayon. They can be used to create really wonderful, beautiful effects, including saturation of color, which is intensity of color. Here I started out with a light blue and moved to a darker blue to add some shading. The key here, friends, is to go light and not press too hard all at once. And then use multiple or different shades of a color or tints of a color to gently color over, and you can see I'm getting some nice shading here with my darker blue, and I'm going in with a darker blue still to add a little bit more dimension or shading effect to my letters. Here's a fun technique that you can get using a combination, again, of crayon and marker. If you start with crayon first, and again, you might want to experiment with this on a separate piece of paper, draw with crayon, and then color over it with a marker. It will create a resist because the crayon is drier than the marker. The marker is, although dry media, it still has water in it. That is how it adds its color. So if you put the marker over the crayon will still show through and the marker will only go where there's white on your paper. But this does tend to smear if you're not careful, so I would recommend experimenting with this first on a separate sheet of paper. Next is one of my favorites, and that is marker with colored pencil. First, color in what you need to add color to with a marker and let it dry. I know we think of markers as things that are already dry the second we put them on the paper, but they do add a little bit of moisture to the paper, so you're not going to want your paper to have that moisture in it when you do the second step, which is coloring over it with colored pencil. And you can see, again, don't press hard with your colored pencils, but shade really lightly, and you can get some really interesting effects and really nice saturation and color intensity by doing things this way with the marker underneath. Again, let it dry a little bit, maybe work on a different area of your work, and then go back and color over it. You can see I'm layering orange and then yellow on top to kind of blend it. This is a good way to add saturation and blend those colored pencils. They can be blended just like I showed you with the crayon. Light layers, even layers that you then build up by coloring very, very gently and lightly and adding a bunch of different colors over one another gives a really, really nice effect. Now, if you really just like working with colored pencil, again, you're going to want to build up your color. Notice there's a trend here. I keep telling you to layer, not just use one color by itself. It really adds intensity to your color and makes your color brighter. Here I'm going to build up with the pinks and the reds, and I'm going to do a gradient or a gradation, which means it's going to go from pink all the way to a darker red. You might be noticing that I keep talking about layering colors and intensity of color. There's a reason. If you're creating a piece of work that is made for reproduction, let's say a fundraiser or a yearbook cover, you're going to want to use large shapes and bright colors because those are going to reproduce well. If the colors are already light and pale, they are not going to reproduce well and will look very washed out. So the secret to having something that is easily read and looks really professional for something like a yearbook cover or a fundraiser is to use larger shapes, bright colors, and depending on if your color or your details or your work is going to be shrunk down, you want fewer tiny details. But if it's not going to be shrunk down in its actual size, you don't have to worry. It will reproduce pretty accurately. But again, going back to that color, you're going to want the colors to reproduce well. And if they're brighter, they tend to reproduce a little bit better than something that is already kind of on the lighter side that will tend to look very washed out overall. All the tips I'm showing you here are definitely not the be-all end-all. This is just based on my experience and just some of the things that we've used in the past that have worked. You are ultimately the creator, you are the artist, and you have to use what inspires you and any techniques that you feel comfortable doing. There are so many different art mediums that could be used, and it's definitely not just limited to what I'm showing you here. So definitely, again, use what you feel most comfortable with. I'm just hoping that some of these tips and tricks will inspire you, you'll experiment with some of them, and maybe be able to use some of them in the future. Now let's talk about our edges. I mentioned this a little bit before. I'm spacing about 2 fingers width, which is about 1 inch in from the edge. I'm going to put some straight lines around all of my edges as a border. I like to use whatever tool I'm using and start at the top of my paper and draw a straight line towards myself. I find that the tool is easier to control that way, like I'm doing here. I almost never go side to side. If I need to do the top and the bottom here, I'm going to turn my paper. Let's talk a little bit about these edges and this border. This border is just for decoration purposes only. It does not include any important information like the letters or the message that I'm trying to communicate through my artwork. So that is totally appropriate. You always want to consider and take into account that no important information should be within 1 inch border of your work if it's going to be reproduced. Because when they go to reproduce it, some of the edges will get cropped off, and in a case like a booklet, let's say, it could be up to 1 inch that gets cut off. So I like to use that 2-finger measurement that you saw a little bit earlier. That usually gives me about the appropriate size. Here I'm just adding some more elements. I'm using a bump and jump, which I know you've heard me say, bump and jump, and just to create a sense of space in the artwork, make it look like the words are in front of some of those shapes that I'm adding. Okay, friends, I do hope you found some of this information helpful. Like I said, this is meant just to be tips on if you are going to be creating something that might be reproduced for either a fundraiser or a booklet of some kind, possibly a yearbook. Remember to stay away from those edges, no important information on the edge. Remember to use bright colors, possibly outline either in Sharpie or colored marker, just so that it can be easily reproduced. And I really cannot wait to see what you create because you're all so amazing. Have a great day and have fun creating.